Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Black on COVID, the Disproportionate Impact of the Pandemic on Black Ontarians. My name is Khalda Saleh. I'm a community legal worker at the Black Legal Action Center. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing the impact of the pandemic on Black people in Ontario, provide information on vaccine efficacy and hesitancy, answer questions about your legal rights and responsibilities at work and at school, and also provide resources for information and help. This webinar is organized by the Black Legal Action Center, BLAC for short. We are a community legal clinic providing free legal services to Black Ontarians and working to combat individual and systemic anti-Black racism in Ontario. If you have experienced anti-Black racism in employment, education, social assistance, human rights, or by the police, you can contact us over the phone or through our website, blacklegalactioncenter.ca. A few housekeeping points before we begin. You can turn on the live transcription option at the bottom of the Zoom window over here. And please note also that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. Each of our panelists will speak, and if we have time at the end of the panel, then we'll answer some of your questions. So if you have questions in the meantime, please write them in the Q&A box at the bottom or write them in the chat. Please keep in mind that we can't answer questions specific to your individual legal issues. So if you have any such questions, please contact us directly. So to begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the land where we are and specifically where the Black Legal Action Center is situated. So the land we're speaking to you from today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and right now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This land is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We also recognize the history of this land as a site of oppression of Black people and the relation between a history of enslavement and settler colonialism. It's very important to frame this conversation through that lens so that we all recognize our position in relation to this land. So now I will introduce our wonderful speakers. First, we have Dr. Akwatu Khenti, who is the Special Advisor to the City of Toronto's Targeted COVID Equity Action Plan and the Chair of the Black Scientist Task Force on Vaccine Equity. Dr. Khenti is an Assistant Professor with the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, where he also serves as Special Advisor on Equity and Inclusion and an Affiliate Scientist with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. He has a PhD in Health Policy and Equity from York University and served as the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Province of Ontario's Anti-Racism Directorate, as well as CAMH's Director of Transformative Global Health. As Chair of the Black Scientist Task Force on Vaccine Equity, he brings his expertise in anti-Black racism, mental health, and the adaptation of mainstream health interventions to African and Caribbean cultures. Welcome, thank you for being here. Hermie Abraham is an accomplished lawyer with application, where she works collaboratively with employees as well as employers on their employment law, labor, and human resources matters. With over 17 years of combined experience in human resources and as a lawyer, Hermie works proactively in strategically advising, representing, and training her clients on all labor and employment law matters. Hermie has written articles for and provided comments on a number of legal and human resources publications, including Lawyers Weekly and HR Professional Magazine. She is regularly called upon to speak and provide training on various aspects of employment laws. She is a lawyer in good standing with the Law Society of Upper Canada in Ontario. She's earned a Bachelor of Commerce degree from Dalhousie University and a Bachelor of Laws degree from Osgoode Hall Law School, York University. Welcome, Hermie. Thank you for being here. Alex Battick is a lawyer who provides legal services who provides services in legal, education, and social service systems. He is passionate and experienced in the pursuit of justice in the lives of children and youth, with an emphasis on assisting students, families, and administrators with education law-related issues. He delivers programs on how to use one's rights and responsibilities in the school system as tools for ensuring success, while regularly advocating and representing parents, teachers, and other stakeholders in Ontario's education system. Alex obtained his Bachelor of Laws degree from City University of London and is a proud alumnus of McMaster University, where he completed an honors Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and was awarded the Bruce M. M. Hamilton Award for significant contribution through extracurricular activities in the benefit of McMaster University and the local community. A licensed lawyer with the Law Society of Ontario, he also holds a certificate of qualification from the Federation of Law Societies of Canada. Prior and concurrent to his leadership with Battick Legal, Alex worked for Empowerment Square, Conquer NCAs, and community legal clinics through the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. His extensive volunteer experience also includes supporting the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic and future director Rexdale Community Health Center and United Achievers Nonprofit Housing, and supporting students' academic needs with the McMaster Success Center. Welcome, Alex. Thank you for being here. And Moya Teklu, who is the BLAC Legal Action's Executive Director and General Counsel. Moya has a long history of working to combat anti-BLAC racism in the justice system. At Legal Aid Ontario, Moya developed a plan that resulted in the delivery of clinic law services to hundreds of BLAC Ontarians, helped bring together and provided staff support to the inaugural board of BLAC, and authored LAO's Racialized Community Strategy. Moya has delivered anti-racism training to hundreds of judges, justices of the peace, lawyers, regulators, adjudicators, and educators across the country. In 2019 and 2020, she was the adjunct professor at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. Moy has participated in proceedings before the Supreme Court of Canada, the Federal Court, the United Nations. She graduated from University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 2009 and was called to the bar in 2010. Thank you all for being here. So we will begin with Dr. Akwatu Khenti. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. A pleasant good evening to all the people out there in Zoom country. I hope I'll speak succinctly. I want to start by acknowledging an enslaved African who arrived here 300 years ago in 1716, maybe 1706 is some debate, and probably from West Africa, an Akan speaking person, a young man. And in 1721, there was a smallpox epidemic in Boston and panic broke out, death was everywhere. And this African told the person who owned him, a minister named Cotton Mather, that he wasn't worried. And Cotton Mather said, "Why are you not worried? Why are you not worried?" He said, "Well, because when I was back in Africa, we have a practice to protect us from that." I said, "Yeah, what do you do?" He explained to the so-called master that when there was an outbreak of what they call diseases of the wind, that's what they call this infectious diseases of the wind, people would scratch the person who was sick, somebody who had mature smallpox, and go around the village sticking people. And that was the practice of inoculation, known then as variolation, or that's the name it was given. He introduced that practice to Boston, and it saved innumerable lives. And do you know there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy in Boston back then? A lot of people refused to apply that practice to themselves because they thought it was pagan African religion, and it would be introducing the devil into their bloodstream. And I mean, you know, things like that. So you see that's 300 years. And for every vaccine that's ever been developed, there's always been multiple opinions on the safety of the vaccine, how it was developed, is the manufacturing okay? And it's been 200 years of vaccine development. But in the past year and a half, never has the world spent as much money on vaccine development as they did on the development of the 4 vaccines which are legally approved in Canada: the mRNA vaccines, the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, and the AstraZeneca vaccine. Billions of dollars spent to protect the lives of the wealthy, largely white populations of the world. That's why those vaccines were produced expeditiously and in timely fashion in order to save lives. We have infectious disease running rampant all across Africa, South America, South Asia, but never has the money been spent in a way that would deliver the goods so quickly, so fast. It's an amazing feat of medical science. And it's worth noting, it all rests on the knowledge that was shared by this enslaved African 300 years ago who didn't get his freedom by sharing the information, no wealth, he didn't get royalties, and only recently was he recognized. That's very important to note as we have this discussion about COVID vaccines. COVID has hit Black people exceptionally hard right across the world, but especially in the Western Hemisphere, in all of the countries of the Americas, as well as countries of Europe, where we have a significant African diaspora, and even in places like Norway, where we are a significant minority. In Norway, people of Somali background died at 10 times the rates of non-Black Norwegians when they got COVID. So you know, but here in Canada, hospitalized 3 times the rate of our white peers. Our death rate, our mortality rate has been twice that of our white Canadian peers. So the impact, the health burden has been huge for Black communities in every city of the country. What's more important as well, or what's equally important as well, is the economic impact. We've had the most job losses. We've had the most depletion of our wealth. In some cases, people have lost their homes. 45% of Black people surveyed earlier this year said they worried constantly about being able to pay the rent. So economically, the COVID shutdowns, the lockdowns, the social distancing requirements has had an inordinate impact upon Black people. So we have been hit in health terms, we've been hit economically, and now we're being hit mentally. The mental health consequences of the COVID pandemic has been huge for people of African descent right across the world. People, we worry about our health, we worry about everything. We've got to know that prior to COVID, we were inordinately placed to worry because we deal with racial microaggressions every day of our life. Racial discrimination is a pervasive reality in our lives. Because of it, we have a lot of chronic conditions that made us vulnerable to severe COVID or severe hospitalization when we got COVID. And our mental health vulnerabilities have been amplified by COVID because COVID has disrupted the way we live as Africans. It has interrupted our communalism, our sharing, our practices, our grieving. We've had so much deaths. Most Black people have lost or know someone who has died compared to their non-Black peers. But those deaths have not been accompanied by the usual grieving processes that we have grown up with. In the Caribbean, we have something called 9 nights. Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, Haiti, Barbados, they all have 9 nights where people come to your house, they drink your rum, eat your food, talk, you laugh, you think it's a party, but it's actually a process of healing and recovery meant to walk you through your grief. And it's an African process we brought from the motherland, which has sustained us through incredible traumas. Because remember, the Black experience is a traumatizing experience from day one, from being kidnapped in Africa, that slave ship, the plantation, the separation, the breakup of the families. Even when we were emancipated, we had to go back into apprenticeship, forced apprenticeship, PTSD galore, but never PTSD as discernible as it is now, because our mental health was never a concern for people who were running the country that we were in. Our vulnerabilities have been exacerbated because of the social determinants of health and the way in which systemic racism works through the social determinants of health. Because of the social determinants of health, we live in places which are densely populated, so we actually interact with more people than those people who live in housings in suburbs. Because of the social determinants of health, we are more likely to take public transit and thus be exposed. Because of the social determinants of health, we did not have the privilege of working from home to the extent that other communities did. And it's not just Black people, it's people from South Asia, people from Latin America, people from the Middle East who work in precarious jobs. We've also had a gendered effect, a gendered outcome, a gendered harm borne disproportionately by women of Caribbean and African descent because of where they work. Home care, healthcare, they're the PSWs, they're the ones who take care of the elderly. And because of that exposure, which is a sort of a built into the job, they have been disproportionately hit by COVID and gotten ill from COVID. And who bears the brunt when they're disadvantaged, when they're made ill? Their families, of course, because many of them are the bread earners, the income earners for their families, their lone families. So you can imagine how this harms, the health harms, the socioeconomic harms, the mental health harms, which are circulating and percolating, have placed people of African descent in such a vulnerable position. But you know, we've made a lot of progress since last October, or I should say last August. We were 30% of the COVID cases last August, even though we're 9% of the Toronto population, so 3 times our share of the population. And over the course of the year, that has been reduced significantly to less than twice. So we've actually been effective and successful at reducing our risk of hospitalization. We've also reduced our vaccine hesitancy and vaccine mistrust through the efforts to explain what's in the vaccine, how was the vaccine produced, the role that Black people have played in from the inception of the vaccine to clinical trials, where there were 10% for the first time in history in the first vaccine. Isn't that ironic? This is the first vaccine. We have been 10% of the people in clinical trials for all the 4 main vaccines. Never happened before, because Black people have rightly been skeptical about clinical trials. You know, nobody's going to rush to do a clinical trial. But with COVID, we knew some of our leaders knew that we were so vulnerable that we had to take some steps, make a few sacrifices, take a few risks in order to protect the overall population health of our people. And so we've done that, we've succeeded, but we still have a long way to go. Last year, 77% of Black people in Toronto and Canada and Ontario said they wouldn't take the vaccine. By June this year, it was 56%. At the beginning of October, it was 36%, compared to 16% of white people in Ontario, white Ontarians. We need to reduce that even further, because 36% of a population unvaccinated is way too high for our population, much less for the society at large. That means we are leaving our elderly, our children at inordinate risk of COVID, should they get it. Thank you very much. I hope that was 10 minutes, and I try to stick within my time so I could have more room, leave more room for discussion later on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was so informative. Hermie Abraham, please take it away.
Okay, unmute myself. Thank you guys so much. First, thank you to BLAC for having me. I'm excited about this talk. I do have some slides, so we can go ahead and post those right now. And I think I want to just start by talking about how how impactful COVID has been, and we will go to the next slide. And I have some statistics here, and these are just general statistics for Ontario about the impact of COVID. And so we've seen how difficult it has been for all of us generally. And as we've seen from the stats before, from Dr. Khenti, that, you know, disproportionately it has been impacting us. If you look at the stats for people in healthcare, of course, there's far more issues around mental health and also just fear of contracting COVID in the workplace. A couple of other interesting stats: in 2016, only 4% of the workforce worked from home, where we see a 30% increase. And then if you look at even like large professional firms, scientific or technical workers, those are 80%. So regardless of where you are, COVID has affected us all. Now, the interesting thing is the unemployment rate for Black people is now down. It's now at 8.9%. So it's down 1.9% from its high during COVID. But we're still higher than many visible minorities. The other visible minorities, the unemployment rate is only 7.8%, and the general population at 6.9%. And that's going to be very important when we start to talk about job loss that might result from a workplace policy. So we can kind of advance to the next slide. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is workplace vaccine and testing policies. And there's been a lot of debate about whether or not it's legal for companies to have workplace vaccine policies or testing policies. And it's fair to say now that yes, absolutely, just as most private organizations can make rules as they desire, for example, a restaurant, no shirt, no shoes, no service, most employers can make vaccine policies or testing policies, provided that it's based on occupational health and safety requirements, not specifically just dogma, and it's made in good faith to protect workers. Now, you hear some arguments, some of the main arguments that are made about whether or not a vaccine or testing policy is legal. And the main one that I normally hear is, disability. So disability is one of the only areas that the law will protect. We'll talk a little bit about human rights later, but under the Human Rights Code, the employer does have a duty to accommodate up to the point of undue hardship. And if there is a medical reason that a person is unable to obtain a vaccine, that will be probably the only exemption that will hold in terms of a workplace mandatory vaccine policy or even a testing policy. But there are still requirements and rules around what that looks like, because it's not a sort of blanket coverage. It's something that, of course, the employee would have to work with their healthcare provider to determine whether or not there was another way that they could comply. And even if they weren't able to be vaccinated at the first instance, whether or not there's a time in the future they might be if the policy continues on. The other area that you hear about is with respects to religion or creed. And in the Human Rights Code, religion is not just regular religion, it's creed. And creed is a closely held belief. And so there was a belief that possibly for religious reasons, people would be able to get exemptions for any kind of vaccine or testing policies, but we're seeing that that's probably going to be unlikely as well too. There have been some creed rulings recently, one in BC, a human rights tribunal, and it dealt with a group, and it's a silly group. They're called themselves Apostafarians, and they wanted to put a colander on their head to be able to take some of their identity, so passports, driver's license. And essentially they felt that it was against their freedom of religion to not allow them to put these colanders on their head because they practice this Pastafarian religion. And that was essentially dismissed, one, because it was silly, but two, there was a recognition that the duty to accommodate, even if it does deal with religion, even if that religion is a truly held belief, does not necessarily go indefinitely. And our Human Rights Tribunal, Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, has said that even if a person could show that they were denied a service or employment because of a creed-based belief against vaccinations, the duty to accommodate does not necessarily require that they be exempted from vaccine mandates, certification, or COVID testing requirements. And they also said that the duty to accommodate can be limited if it would significantly compromise health and safety, amounting to undue hardships, such as during a pandemic. So anybody who's looking for a religious exemption, I think that those exemptions are not going to be possible on a go-forward basis. The other one that you hear is charter rights. People say that this is a breach of my charter rights. And although this might work or might apply in some workplaces, for the majority of people, the charter rights argument is not going to apply. And it's because the charter rights deal with the Constitution. When somebody says my charter rights have been breached, it means that something is unconstitutional. And so the charter deals with, let's say, a vaccine passport, like the Ontario government is rolling out, or any other government action as it pertains to somebody personally. Because most workplaces are privately run, privately regulated, they're not going to be subject to any type of charter challenge. So there's no charter rights or rights and freedoms arguments that can be made in an employment context, unless we're talking about a government actor who is making some kind of rule. And the last one is with respects to privacy of somebody's information. And the privacy commissioners released a joint statement back in May, and this was specific with vaccine passports, but basically what they said is that they didn't have this a blanket prohibition on the collection of information. What they've essentially said is that organizations are looking to roll out any type of policy, and they need to collect information as it pertains to that policy, should collect the minimal information they need to be able to satisfy the need. And in my opinion, if somebody is just having to declare whether or not they're vaccinated, they're not necessarily providing their healthcare information, such as the vaccine that they had when, that should be, I believe, okay. I don't know if that means I'm running out of time. I'm gonna quickly look and see. But let's move to the next slide. And we'll talk a little bit about some human rights issues. With respects to human rights, the other intersection with workplace issues and COVID is the whole notion of alternate workplace arrangements. We've talked a little bit about the vaccine policies, and we know that disability is the only one that's going to really hold with respects to any type of workplace policy. But the other thing is with respects to family arrangements, when people do need to take time away from work. So to shorten things, I will say that there is a family status requirement under the Human Rights Code, which means that if you do have family obligations that make it difficult for you to participate in the workplace in a way other people would if they didn't have these family issues, then you can seek accommodation from your employer. And that becomes important for people who have school-age children, elderly parents who are taking care of others in their family. That family status accommodation is very important. And the last thing I want to mention really quickly in the time that I have remaining is with respects to temporary dismissal. So if we just can go on to the next slide. Temporary and permanent dismissals. A number of people were laid off as a result of COVID. And there was a big question about whether or not these layoffs constituted, and this is for non-unionized workplaces, whether or not those layoffs constituted some kind of constructive termination or constructive dismissal, where the employee was could treat their employment as terminated. There have been cases back and forth. The majority have said that the fact that there is a temporary layoff, even if it is related to COVID, might not necessarily discharge an employer from having to provide a separation package, that the employee may be able to treat themselves as dismissed. However, I would say that that is on a case-by-case basis. And so if your employer isn't recalling you after these emergency leaves go out of effect, then definitely there would be a case of dismissal, or if your employer is not returning you to your pre-COVID job in terms of the time. The other thing I wanted to mention with respects to dismissals is that employers are absolutely allowed to dismiss somebody who does not want to comply with a policy, such as a vaccine or testing policy. And although those dismissals in most cases will be on a without cause basis, meaning that person might still be entitled to a separation package, ultimately there could be situations where somebody would be terminated for frustration of contract, which would mean that they've done so that it's not the fault of the employer, but not necessarily the fault of the employee either. And where there's a frustration, there is no termination pay or even notice due to the employee. And it worries me that in our community, there could be a disproportionate number of people who will lose their jobs. And I think that the economic impact of that, because of vaccine policies, would be, a very unfortunate and a further harm of this this pandemic on us. So that's all I have right now. I do want to leave some time for questions, so I will conclude, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Hermie. Alex, if you're ready to go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Welcome everyone this evening. Thank you for joining us. Before I get into it, I just want to give a shout out to all the students, staff, parents who have had an incredibly challenging past 2 years. I know that we have, as a community, as a society, put a lot on young people and their families to get through a burden that I'm sure many of us feel quite often. So thank you to you for joining, and thank you for the ongoing work that you're doing for us. So what I want to discuss pretty briefly is just education as it relates to the events of COVID and perhaps the unique challenges that COVID has placed on members of the Black community in Ontario. More generally, though, we'll start off with some of the policies that have been affecting students and staff, teachers. Firstly, students have been affected by things like the masking policy, masking mandates in schools, and generally regarded as a public health measure. The masking requirements have required students to literally mask up before they head into schools. If they're in public spaces, they've typically had to wear a mask, and only if they're generally outside of a group or outside in a wide environment has that been permitted to be removed. So the masking aspect of it is quite familiar to most of us. We have to comply with these public health orders in many different public settings. For teachers as well, there's a masking mandate, but very similar to the students as well. What's a little bit unique for schools is that they are, when it comes to vaccine requirements, it's a little bit more of a different set of rules between the teachers and students, obviously. We know that the vaccine requirements currently are for ages, I believe, 12 and up, or somewhere, or it's available for ages 12 and up. For teachers, there are vaccine requirements that have been made. And I think Hermie speaks a little bit more about the employment aspect that is generally applicable to teachers as well. So school boards as employers are entitled under the management rights provisions of and their obligations under the Ontario Health and Safety Act to establish policy which requires mandatory vaccination and the disclosure of vaccination status. But given the sensitive nature of personal medical information, the employer is generally required to ensure that the worker's vaccine status information is kept confidential. But for a policy to be enforceable, it must provide at minimum an exemption for workers on the grounds of human rights. And this will come in the form of an accommodation. So teachers that seek an exemption based on, or staff that are in schools that seek an exemption based on code protected grounds must provide a valid and defensible evidentiary basis for getting such an exemption, like medical exemptions from a physician, a statement from a nurse, setting out the basis on which the vaccine is contradicted, as well as the duration of the issue, things like that, and so on and so forth. But what are the consequences of non-vaccination for staff at schools? Given that there is a group of people, young people that they are working with that aren't vaccinating quite often, many of them aren't, especially because of the age exemptions from the vaccine eligibility. There are potential consequences based on whether the teacher has a code-based exemption or whether the teacher does not. For those that do have a code-based exemption, the employer is required to accommodate them up to a point of undue hardship. And that accommodation process requires the participation and involvement of three parties, which are the school board, the union, and the teacher themselves. The nature of that accommodation will vary greatly depending on the nature of the employee's accommodation needs and their work. So I think we touched a little bit more about this earlier about the employment requirements, but a more interesting issue that's perhaps coming closer than we might expect is regarding all students and the vaccine requirements for them. So I know that in the next few weeks, months, we can expect to see vaccine eligibility for younger people, I believe 5 and up. And what does that mean for schools? Well, the Immunization it's the Immunization something act, I can't remember off the top of my head, I'm sorry. But it already lists the vaccine requirements for students in schools. So students are actually already required by law to be vaccinated before they enter public schools with a list that you can see in the act. There is some contemplation that this might be included in the act as well. Sorry, the COVID vaccines might be included in the act as well. What that means for students and for parents is that especially those who may be concerned about vaccine requirements for their child. It means a couple of different things. So while the vaccine is currently not mandatory for students of any age, that vaccine status should not impact the child's ability to participate in school or school-related activities at this time. But conversely, many parents are desperate to protect their children from unvaccinated school staff and peers. So typically they're seeking some combination of the ability to compel the disclosure of other people's vaccine status, or the right to keep unvaccinated students and teachers away from their children. But if vaccines do become mandated for students, accommodations for medical or other exemptions in place is a tool, such as the Statement of Conscious or Religious Belief from the Immunization of Schools Pupils Act. I think that's what it was called. And that is maybe a grounds, but as we also discussed earlier, it might be very narrow exemptions that are allowed by law from any vaccine status, vaccine requirement. But there are a number of other things that I think pose a threat to families as well, in terms of the privacy of a child's medical information. But the reality is there are many different ways in which the school can have those things protected. Right now, the teachers who currently have to disclose their status are only required to do so to their employer, and there are mechanisms in place that prevent that information from getting out. It's to be seen how that will be done for children themselves, but certainly something that won't be foreign, it won't be new. It's, like I said, something that's already included in the Immunization of Pupils Act. So pretty familiar with that already. I know that we have a limited amount of time, but I know that there are a lot of other issues that particularly Black students and families have been facing over the past couple of months. And certainly COVID has posed challenges related to safety, but for the Black community, Black Ontarians, the pandemic is just another ongoing social issue that we face in our communities, especially in the education system. I think it'd be remiss of us to forget that during this global pandemic, there was also to some degree a social awakening in many different institutions about anti-Black racism and what that means for the Black community in different institutions. And when it comes to education, that's a real issue that's still ongoing. So for students across Ontario, these challenges are still ongoing in the education system, and things that continue to be unresolved are things like how to fully deal and react with issues of human rights and anti-Black racism in schools. A legitimate point that perhaps might be a little bit unrelated to COVID specifically, but at the same time, we can't escape the fact that these are compounding issues that families are facing. The social and economic barriers that are produced by COVID, but also the institutional barriers from systemic racism are things that the Black community are uniquely challenged by and continue to be challenged by. So things that need to be resolved are, what are the complaint mechanisms available for school boards and stakeholders in those school boards? I think I'll leave it at that. I don't want to take up too much time. Quite a bit of issues that I think school boards are facing right now, but certainly things that we can discuss in the question section if you do have any specific questions related to COVID. But I'm going to let Moya take it from here. Thank you so much.
Alden, you took your job. Okay, I'll take it from here. Thank you so much, and thank you to the speakers for joining us, and thank you to all of you for taking some time to be with us tonight. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the policy issues related to the vaccine rollout and the concerns that the folks at the Black Legal Action Center have with respect to emergency measures and vaccine mandates and vaccine passports generally. So in April of 2021, which feels like a very long time ago, but it was just a few short months ago, the Institute for Clinical and Evaluative Sciences found that there was a serious inequity in the rollout of vaccines. Areas of Ontario with the highest rates of COVID also had the lowest vaccination rates and vaccines. Researchers at the Wellesley Institute found that Ontario was not concentrating its vaccination efforts in places with the highest rates of illness, and that the province was not distributing vaccines in an equitable way to areas with racialized populations and low-income neighborhoods. This was particularly pronounced in Toronto, where rich white neighborhoods like Rosedale, Forest Hill, and Forest Hill South had the highest vaccination rates of over 20%, but Jane and Finch had the lowest with just over 5%. These things that don't just happen, they are the result often of policy decisions and often of not having the right people at the table. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Khenti for being at this table and for advocating to improve the availability of vaccines. But you'll remember that when the provincial government released its list of 114 hotspots, it decided to give priority vaccine access to 5 neighborhoods that actually had hospitalization and death rates that were below the provincial average. And we'll know more about why and how those neighborhoods were prioritized when the Auditor General releases her report on the COVID-19 immunization strategy and implementation. As another example of the policy issues that we saw sort of come to the surface during this pandemic, in June 2021, CBC reported that between March 2020 and June 2021, 268 out of every 1,000 people in provincial jails and 126 out of every 1,000 people in federal prisons tested positive for COVID. This is compared to 37 per 1,000 people in the general population. So between rates that were between 4 and 7 times higher than the general population in jails and prisons. At that time, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization recommended that people in jails and prisons should receive their vaccines in phase 2 before healthy Canadians over the age of 60. But by the end of phase 2, so the beginning of phase 3, less than 50 out of 500 folks in the Toronto East Detention Center had received their vaccine. And many of you will know that given anti-Black racism in the criminal justice system, Black people are overrepresented in provincial jails and federal prisons. And again, these aren't things that just happen. They're policy decisions about whose lives matter and whose don't. The issues with the enforcement of emergency measures is the same issue as with any law enforcement, really, which is a concern that law enforcement officers will target Black people and disproportionately target or card Black people. And we've already seen examples of this. You will remember that in March of 2020, so at the very beginning of this thing, the province declared a provincial emergency. Shortly after, Toronto did the same thing and announced that the city was closing playgrounds, parks, sports fields, picnic areas, and dog parks. And they imposed physical distancing in city parks and public squares. The city also announced that COVID-19 enforcement team made up of bylaw enforcement officers, would be enforcing these rules and issuing fines. Well, an investigation by the Toronto Ombudsman found that the bylaw enforcement officers didn't receive adequate training on how to exercise their judgment and discretion in a fair and equitable way. And 2 independent investigations found that 2 different bylaw enforcement officers discriminated against Black people by issuing tickets and targeting Black people and not doing the same to the white people who were in Centennial and High Park at the same time. And so these are the concerns that continue to exist with respect to vaccine passports and vaccine mandates. There's a concern that they will be used to further criminalize, marginalize, and punish Black people. Specifically, that members of law enforcement will continue to use the pandemic as a justification to increase their ability to stop people and demand that they provide information, personal information. A practice that we know has targeted Black, Indigenous people and people with mental health issues. And also that we'll see this come up in service delivery. So, we know that it's a breach of human rights law, both federal and provincial, to deny someone access to any good or service because of their race, color, or ethnicity. But we also know that Black customers are already significantly more likely to be followed, searched, and ignored, we're seeing a bit of this at BLAC, to be trespassed when they challenge being followed, searched, or ignored. And so we're concerned that the vaccine mandates or passports may be used as a pretext for what would otherwise be consumer racial profiling or shopping while Black. And the same goes for using vaccine mandates or passports as a pretext in the education system. So Alex alluded to this, but it's been well documented and continues to be well documented that Black students are disproportionately targeted for discipline in the form of suspensions and expulsions. And we are paying attention to see whether and how the pandemic sort of interplays with the anti-Black racism that already exists in the education system. So I just want to end in terms of resources, just to again say what Khalda said at the beginning of this session, which is that if you experience racial profiling by a police service or a business or a school, and that you can contact the Black Legal Action Center. Black staff can provide you with information, advice, or support on how to file a human rights application at the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario or with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And our staff can also assist with or provide you information on how to file a police complaint.
Thank you so much, Moya, and thank you to all of our speakers. This was extremely informative. So we have some time now for some questions. I think Hermie's answered a lot of the questions that have come in already. Thank you. There's one question here that says, can a doctor refuse to serve unvaccinated patients? Could someone answer that?
I would just say that I'm not sure, but I think that it would also depend on the regulatory, the College of Medical Professionals, or whatever their regulatory body is, because they would have duties under that. But quite honestly, with some of the medical professionals, they are private actors, right? And so they can, so long as they're not discriminating based on any human rights, so for race or creed or disability, they weren't discriminating based on that. They can discriminate based on other factors, right? And so that might be possible, but I would kind of leave that to somebody who might have a better sense of the regulatory aspects of a medical professional and what they're required to do.
Yeah, perhaps the question may need to be a little bit more narrow and, sorry. When you say your service, is it to be in a hospital? Because unvaccinated patients, I think, are still eligible to have services in the hospital. What about doctors refusing to perhaps provide supporting documentation for people who choose to be unvaccinated and perhaps apply for exemptions? I know that, to Hermie's point, the college provides policy guidelines in terms of how to approach an issue like that. And I kind of alluded to this before, but there are very narrow exemptions for when a vaccine exemption can be given. And for a medical reason, doctors are now being told it's only a very limited set of medical conditions that might allow for a medical exemption. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you. We have a question here also about, while we're on the topic, human rights complaints and applications and backlogs. So how can we manage expectations given those backlogs?
Sorry, so the question is, filing a human rights complaint is problematic given the backlogs, and how can we manage expectations? So, I think because of what is happening, particularly with the provincial human rights system and the, I guess, reluctance to appoint more vice chairs and thereby sort of increasing the length of the delays, I think that is how you manage the expectations, is by letting people know that when they file their human rights applications, justice will be delayed. But there are ways in which that can be expedited, specifically by moving out either outside of the human rights process, or by mediating, by agreeing to mediate the human rights application. So those are two of the ways to manage those expectations and to expedite the process, I think.
I would echo the same thing, Moya. The Human Rights Tribunal is a very lengthy process during normal times, and maybe even more so now, which poses a real challenge to just resolving a matter. But that's not the only way in which you can have that matter resolved. Alternative ways in which you can do so is, and starting a human rights application is still a very legitimate and useful thing to do. It starts a conversation at the very least between you and the respondent. So that perhaps opens up an avenue for dialogue to a resolution, either through a mediation where a mediator is called upon, or through informal or formal settlement discussions with the respondent as well. But certainly managing the expectations of the tribunal is a conversation that has to be had early on, but it's certainly not the only way in which you can seek to resolve a matter.
Thank you. We have a question here also. It's a little bit long, so I'm not going to read out the entire question, but it's about Indigenous and Black people who are hesitant about taking the vaccine and current government regulations. So the question is, what can concerned community members and frontline workers do coercing people who are hesitant, given how many have been double vaccinated at this stage? Seems like it will perpetuate inequities rather than protect people. So are there any recommendations basically on how to deal with that hesitancy?
So yeah, so I would say that, we continue, the Black Scientist Task Force is continuing to do public education, because we believe that the best citizen is a citizen who chooses to be vaccinated on their own volition and weighs the pros and cons and decides based on the evidence what they're going to do. And so we had planned to end our work in July, but because we realize, 36% of our population still needs to be convinced, and that's why we're here to do it. The only thing I would say to community groups that have concern about the nature of the mandates is to seek to find out what was the race equity analysis that was done when the policy was rolled out. Because my understanding from the Anti-Racism Act is, if you're having a policy that has racialized implications, you need to have mitigation strategies in place to prevent racialized outcomes or to reduce harms associated with or therein. So has race equity impact, were race equity impact assessments conducted? And if so, what were the findings, and were appropriate policies put in place to mitigate the risk? And I would say, to some extent, within the past few months, 2 months, there's been an intensification of vaccination, and vaccines are being taken to the door, and the government has been much more inclined in the last few weeks and months to support vaccine equity than it was in earlier months. So that's a positive development. Is it a timely development? No, but it's a positive development, yes.
Thank you. We have a question also. Hermie, if you could please elaborate a bit more on the family status accommodation.
Sure, and I'll have anybody else kind of chip in if they want, but Under the human rights, Ontario Human Rights Code, there is a duty to accommodate family status. Family status is defined as being in a parent-child relationship. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a parent of a child. It could be somebody caring for an older adult family member who's a parent type of relationship to them. So it's not only just parents, but people who are caring in a parent-child relationship. And although I would say that the law across Canada, even Ontario, is a little kind of muddled as to exactly what that duty to accommodate looks like, I would say that if somebody has childcare obligations that are impacted because of that impacts their work because of either COVID or some other force outside of the employee's control, that there is a legal requirement for the employer to at least start explore what it would look like to help and assist this person so they would be able to continue to participate in the workplace. So that could be a change in shift or the change in the way that they work. I will say this, that accommodation isn't perfect, right? And with the family status accommodation, you do tend to find the more leniency on what for the employer on that not being perfect, right? So simply because maybe somebody wants to work a different shift, that's not going to be a necessarily accommodation unless it seems reasonable. It's nebulous in terms of the way that it sort of plays out. But as far as the law is concerned, when it is a family-child relationship and somebody has limitations because of work, because of the family-child relationship, there is a positive obligation on the employer to accommodate. And maybe Moya or, oh, sorry, I forgot your name. Alex can jump in and add a little bit more.
I actually don't have anything to add, Hermie. I think that that essentially sums it up. It's defined as the relationship between a parent and a child. And so if you find that your parental obligations or even your familial obligations are getting in the way of you being able to sort of work your regular shift, I mean, accommodation essentially is saying, no, this is the regular way that we do it, but we don't have to do it this way. Or we might not have to do it this way. It might not be a bona fide occupational requirement. And that's the language that they use in the human rights world, meaning it's not like a real legitimate work requirement that you have to be here from 9 to 5 every day. You can take a little break in the middle if it means, you have to pick up your child from school or something like that. You don't get fired just because of that. I mean, to put it in very sort of lay terms. But that's essentially it. In the same way, if you had to come, if we weren't working remotely and your child ended up getting sent home from school, which is something that is happening more and more often because they had a runny nose or something like that. But you could continue to work from home, that would be an accommodation or example of accommodation on the basis of family status as well.
And I just want to add something really quickly there. The emergency measures that have been put in place with the infectious disease emergency leave are due to end at the end of December of this year. And so a lot of the protections that are in this legislation for people to be able to take time away from work for kids who might have COVID or family parents, those are going to end. And so I think that that's where we're going to see these human rights engaged a bit more.
Great, thank you all. We have another question here about, I don't know if this question is only for Moya, so it's better for Moya, but maybe for everybody. Talking about steps people can take if they are denied entry into restaurants, for example, considering vaccine mandate requirements like QR codes and stuff, and what are their rights?
I mean, so I did see that question, but to be honest, I don't have an answer. I'm not really sure. I am aware that different provinces are doing it differently, which is going to, I think, caused problems. And that was sort of the push for, why isn't there sort of a national system or a national approach to this? Because it's going to hinder our ability to travel interprovincially, possibly. But I'm not really sure sort of how to address, you have proof of vaccine in Ontario or in Quebec. Does that also provide you with entry into a venue or a service in Ontario? I would assume that it would, because just having been out and about in the world, people, the QR codes are sort of a recent development, but they're not the only way to provide proof of vaccination. I think some people are showing paper documents and other people are showing emails. And so I don't know that there is only one accepted way to demonstrate that you have received the vaccine. I don't know if that answers your question. And I'm happy to pass it off to Hermie or Alex if they have a better, more eloquent or articulate, or Dr. Khenti.
I think you answered that spot on. I think the only thing I would add or to say or ask in this question is, are we talking about privacy issues, right? So is this the fear that another province is now going to have information that you don't want to share? So I'm curious, but I will say this, as far as private organizations are concerned, they can set their own rules other than the government directives that they have to work under, but they can set their own rules. And so denying access to somebody because they don't feel that they have enough information about a person's vaccine status, I see that being completely legal. And maybe it'll be masked in the way that they're going to disproportionately do this to people within our community. But I don't see private organizations not being able to say, okay, well, I can't read this or it's not legible, and so I'm not going to let you in, and being held to a different standard. My 2 cents.
Yeah, I'd echo everything that both Moya and Hermie has said. I think one thing I would consider, though, and I'm not a practitioner in Quebec or any other province. So of course, if there's any reason to believe that you were denied entry for an alternative reason that isn't related to your vaccine status, if you suspect that might be based on a prohibited ground such as race, then you certainly want to look into whether or not you can protect your rights in that circumstance. In Ontario, we do have vaccine requirements right now, but there are accommodations that are also allowed for that. So I think some places allow for masking as an alternative and perhaps alternative seating. But if for some reason you believe that that safety requirement isn't the reason for you being allowed entry and it might be related to race, certainly document your experience and look into a human rights application or contact the BLAC Legal Action Center or the Human Rights Legal Support Center for more support.
Thank you, everyone. All right, so I think we can have just one last question. Dr. Khenti can answer this question. I'll summarize 2 questions into one. So for individuals who have decided to delay taking the vaccine until there's more information and data available about the trials and the responses, could you just talk a bit about that a bit?
Yeah, so I get this a lot, this question about waiting. And I tell people, almost 6 billion doses have been dispensed. This is unprecedented. The amount of vaccinations that's taken place, largely in high-income countries, of course. But we have a lot of data globally from the 150 countries around the world where people are being vaccinated. And it's almost a year. Most severe allergic reactions or adverse reactions take place within 3 months of a vaccine. So we actually have a very strong evidence base for these particular vaccines. And so there's no reason to wait. In fact, waiting increases your risk of getting COVID, and you don't know individually if you're going to get a COVID with asymptomatic, you actually didn't even know you had COVID, or you'll be the one person who gets severe COVID and ends up in an ICU on a ventilator or something like that. So there's no rationale for waiting. Martin Luther King wrote a book, Why We Can't Wait. And I'm telling you why you shouldn't wait. The risk of COVID outweigh the risk of the vaccine. We've had vaccines for about 200 years. It's not a new technology. The only new or novelty about is the mRNA vaccines, but that's been around for 10 years, more than 10 years, developed for SARS and MERS, but no market and no money like we have for COVID. So I'm very confident about the vaccines for adults. I'm waiting to see the data for children, but for adults, I advise everyone to get vaccinated as soon as possible.
All right, thank you so much. So I think on that note, it's time to end this webinar. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. We do have a little survey that we'd like you to answer just to provide us with some feedback on this event and hopefully, inform our next event so it's even better. So Sade, if you can launch the poll from your end. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much to our speakers. This was extremely informative and just very helpful, I think, for a lot of people. And thank you to our attendees for being here and for everyone also who answered the poll questions. This webinar is going to be recorded and posted on our website later on so it can be shared with others. And yeah, get in touch with us if you'd like. Thank you.